Assalamu alaikum. As I told in my last video, we are going to start implementing the relationship. So today we are going to implement one-to-one relationship and its subtype optional one-to-one, which is one of the most common subtype of one-to-one relationship. And before that, let's move this logic to a separate controller because home controller doesn't make sense to me anymore because we are doing user related operations in this controller, so that should be a user controller, I think. For that one, I will be adding a folder API and we'll be adding a new controller here, and that would be, let's say, an empty controller for now. API empty controller, let's add it and we will name it as users controller, and let's move everything from within that user controller, from within home controller to the user controller, and we can name this constructor to users controller, and everything should be working fine. Alright, all the errors are removed. Now our user controller should be empty. We don't need anything in our user controller anymore. Let me make this one empty. We don't need any service in here. Clean. Okay. Underscore user service. Where is this underscore user service? Let us debug. Seems it's working fine. Great. And if we hit the users controller, we will be now getting back our result, which is good. Okay. At some point, we will be converting this API controller to MVC based controller to list the all endpoints there, but that is not main agenda for today's video. All right, so we are going to start with one-to-one relationship today, and specifically in one-to-one, optional one-to-one will be the topic of today. For that one, I will straight jump into our user entity, which we created last time. Okay, so this is our user entity. It has ID and name. Let's say a user can have address as well, and though we can add a separate column here, but for the detail address, ideally we should have a separate table. So that relationship kind of make exact sense for one-to-one relationship. So for that one, I will be creating a new entity here, public class user address entity, and here we will have a primary key, then we'll have address line 1 which should be required, and address line 2 should be optional. And now comes the relationship bar. For creating a relationship, the dependent entity should have the ID of the independent entity, which means we will having a public int optional user ID here, and public, not this one, public uh, user entity, and that is user, and that will be nullable as well. So this is the first step for creating a relationship between two entities, one-to-one relationship. And second one is, in the independent entity we need to add a navigation property. For that one, we will be adding a reference user address entity, and we can name it like a now same address as the name of the entity. So this is how we have established a one-to-one relationship between user entity and user address entity classes, and this relationship is optional, which means we can create a user without specifying its address. One thing I forgot was that question mark. But if we want to supply address or provide address, we can do that as well, which means one user can have one address and one user can have no address, right? Okay, let's jump back to our post endpoint. Previously, we used our models, which is the best way, and the recommended way. Let's say if we just remove this from here, the user model, and directly use our entity class, which is user entity. like this. And for some time, let's comment this one and directly pass user entity to our create user service method. All right. Because we have did few changes in the entities, next step would be to add migration to reflect those changes to the database. User address entity has been added, which is now this is the migration file. We can see a new table will be created with those properties ID, address line 1, which is required, address line 2, which is nullable 2, which is not required, and the user ID, the foreign key for our user table. And these are the constraints on foreign key and the primary key, and these are now this is the index on that user ID column. So that is been taken care by Entity Framework Core, and now let's apply those changes by doing update database. Successfully done. And if we now try to see our tables here, we should see user address entity table as well. And if we go to the migration history table, we have a new migration with name user underscore address has been applied. Great. And let's jump back to the HTTP file and let's try to run this once and send a call. Are we getting any results? No, we are not getting any results at the moment, which means if we see, are there any records in the table? Yes, there are. There is one record. So ideally, okay, now the URL. So that should be now users as well. Okay, we are getting one record, which is good. Now let's try to create a new user. For that one, we can hit directly and yeah, users, and that point endpoint would be the users. Hit directly, which means user has been created. And if we send request, now we are getting second user, which means the address was optional. And if we supply the address now, which was user address, what was the name we mentioned there? User address entity. And if we provide this line 1, which was required for us, let's say ABC, and we hit okay, user entity field is required. Okay, the bracket is missing, the curly braces. The curly braces was missing. Now send the request. Let me rerun again and send the request now. It means it's created now. And if I send the get request, we are not getting any user address entity because by default lazy loading is enabled, so we need to include that entity, that relationship, to get that explicitly. So for that one, I will go to the service method, go to implementation here, and we need to explicitly include that relationship. So the direct entity will be pulled, but relationships will not unless we include those explicitly. So what was the name of relationship? That was user address entity. Let's pull that one from that query as well. Control F5 and send the request. Okay, now a possible object cycle, and what it means is because we have a user entity here, inside user entity we have a user address entity, and again in the user address entity we have a user entity, and seem like a cycle is created. To rectify that one, let's jump back to our program.cs file, and where we have added controllers, we need to add option here that add JSON options, and we are saying that ignore those cycles. It's preventing us that there is a cycle happening and it will not be able to handle it, the .NET framework. So we are saying that let's ignore for now. And if we now enter press Ctrl F5 and try to hit over get endpoint. We will now have that newly created user, its name and its related address as well. We can see that. So we have successfully created a relationship one-to-one, and in its type it's one-to-one optional. Main entity can be created without dependent one, and we can create the relationship as well. All right, the last thing was we have removed the model while creating the record. So let's revert that and let's change that one to user model. That should be model and this one, which means we need to duplicate our address entity in terms of model business model presentation as well, which means we should not directly use the database table representative entities, the POCO classes inside our controllers or services. We should always use the models for that one. Okay, now let's go back here and create the same user address model. And what was the user address model? And that is the user model. All right, because we haven't added any model mapping library or logic, so we have to do that manually. For that one, we will be creating a user entity as we are doing previously. Here we will be adding a new user address entity, and let's pause now. If that is not null, then we can set user entity dot address entity is equal to new user address entity, and address line 1 is equal to model dot address line 1, address line 2 is equal to, let's make a post request now and get request. Now we're getting the related entity as well. In the top we have the user related properties, and then inside user address entity we are getting the address as well. So this is how we can implement one-to-one relationship using entity framework, and this is the bare minimum which we need. In both the entities, add the properties and the navigation properties, and just add a migration and fetch the related entities. We should need to include the relationship name as well. So we are pulling users, but with users we want to pull their user address entity record as well. So I am committing this code into the repositories. In case of any questions, do ask me in the comments. And in the next video, we will try to implement one-to-many relationship, and we'll create a scenario and we'll implement in this project. So that was all for today.